Hello, good afternoon, and welcome you all to this meeting for cattle business unit in MSD Mexico. It's a pleasure to introduce Maxi Leche 2020. Now it's going to be virtual, but it's going to be super productive. I'm Grisel Trejo in behalf of MSD Animal Health in Mexico and Latin America. And it's a laboratory for the development of innovative products for animal health. And we have the science for the healthiest animals. We have a big portfolio for prevention and treatment in production animals. So now we are going to start to introduce a, a video for what is Maxi Leche, and then we will start with our session.
Nos tocó vivir la adversidad más grande de nuestras vidas.
Nos dijeron que teníamos que parar.
Pero nuestro trabajo es importante. No podemos parar.
Nos adaptamos.
Nos organizamos.
Nos apoyamos.
Nos esforzamos.
Nos reinventamos.
Todo para respaldar a nuestros clientes.
A las familias mexicanas.
Con calidad y salud.
Justo lo que las familias mexicanas necesitan.
Seguiremos trabajando en la sala,
En la cocina.
En el comedor.
En nuestras casas.
Y en el campo también.
Siempre apoyando a nuestros clientes.
Somos MSD Ganadería.
Hello and good afternoon. I'm Tiago Hernandez, the General Director for Merck Animal Health, and it's for me a pleasure to greet you all. Thank you for being here with us in this important event for us. MSD is a company that more than 130 years works for the production and development of products, vaccines, and we have a big focus in innovation. We invest more than 20% of our sales in research and development for new products. But we know that the products are not only the solution that we have to provide for you, our commercial partners. We know that the products are a very important part of a whole system that has as a basis the people. So that's why we support the development of our people, of our team, so they could connect our products with the services. We know that each customer and each partner needs a solution that has to be a tailor-made suit for everybody, and especially today that we are going through challenging times of the global economy in our country, we have to be always focused looking for our best version, what we could offer for you that are the main players of this economic sector, which is the sector that produces food for us and for many countries with all the tools so you could go on producing food for Mexicans. And today we are talking about such a kind and noble food, milk, which is fundamental for all the people in their development and the health. So, talking about this program, Maxi Leche, is a pride. I'm very happy. As you could see, I'm not from Mexico, I'm from Brazil. But I saw this program born in Brazil, and now I see that my Mexican team has increased and they have made it grow amazingly. So, I want to congratulate my team of American Animal Health in the cattle business unit for being, and also each one of you to be here with us. The implementation of the services, the guidance, and the communication with veterinarians, distributors, and producers is fundamental so we could be working together in this development track. I am very, very pleased to be the leader of this MSD team, and I am very, very happy having you all as our partners. Thank you very much for giving us all the support and count with MSD for whatever you need. We are here to understand how could we be the best option. So this is a program that starts today, September 24, and ends October 22. We will have every Thursday a meeting to talk about milk quality, the other health, transition, everything. Topics that are very important. We have very distinguished speakers that they are going to add lots of value to each one of you. So, well, thank you and count on MSD. We are here to support you. And Chris, thank you. Please. Thank you very much, Tiago. Welcome you all again to this first session of Maxi Leche. We want to thank all the team in the business unit for cattle in Mexico, our director Vicente Guerrero, Arturo Sepúlveda, he's in marketing, Arturo Hernandez, Sergio Maines, that he is supporting for all the, well, Eduardo Vargas in the chat for questions, and all the team that we have here in production, the salespeople, everybody involved in the cattle team, that they are making this possible, that they are in contact here and for our country, making a better country, and that we support to production. So, well, now to start with our first session in Maxi Leche, I am going to introduce our speaker. He is going to talk about current topics in other health. He's Dr. Lowell Media. He is a technical service manager in Merck US. He is expert in beef and dairy cattle, and now he is giving the veterinary services, and he has a PhD in the University of Pennsylvania, and he is professor in the Ohio State University. He is part of the CAT Association and part of the committee of the American Association of Bovine Practitioners. He has many publications in veterinary medicines, also books in ruminant health. So, Dr. Lowell, the floor is yours.
Gracias. Gracias. Give me a moment to share my screen. And can you hear me okay, Lulu?
Yes, very well, doctor. Go ahead.
Okay. So, hola, everyone. And I'm very pleased, happy to be here to visit with you a little bit about mastitis and udder health today. So if we can make the thing advance. So we're going to talk about dairy cows. And basically, I centered my presentation around several questions, right? We're just going to answer these questions. Should we treat cows? Is the dry period important? Should we treat cows at dry off? What about vaccination? And a little bit about the future. So that's our plan. But before we get into the questions, we're not going to talk about many things. So mastitis and udder health involves many factors, and we're not going to cover all of them. Way back in 1970 was the origin of the mastitis 5-point plan. And the mastitis 5-point plan has been adopted for the world over. And it's very simple. And I would encourage you to look up, think about the mastitis 5-point plan. But several of those things on the 5-point plan. So, for example, parlor prep procedure, how we prepare cows for milking. So it's important to apply the unit to clean, dry teats. And that's one of those things that is, easy for veterinarians and dairy farmers to say, but there's 1,000 different ways to implement that, right? But if we all just apply the unit to clean, dry teats, we're well along the way to preventing mastitis, particularly for Streptococcus uberis. And then milking machine function. Very commonly, the only the company that installed the milking machine will periodically evaluate it. I would encourage every dairy to have someone who is not the company that installed the machine. So get an independent consultant at least once a year to evaluate vacuum and pulsators and milk flow, for example. So milk flow is evaluated using something called a lactoquarter or a Vadia machine. And that it evaluates not only the milking machine, but also the prep procedure, right? So if we prep them properly, milk flow is going to increase rapidly, go along a nice line, and then drop off quickly, and then the machine will immediately come off. If it drops off slowly and the milking machine is trying to milk a teat with no milk coming out, that can lead to teat end lesions and things like that. So the point of all this is have someone other than the milking machine company evaluate the machine. And then, of course, post-milking teat dipping, the single most important mastitis control measure. Every teat, every cow, every milking. And then finally, the cow's environment, right? Sand is the best environment. We all know that, but even sand must be managed. Anything less than sand, and we're going to start having problems. So, way back in veterinary school in about 1988, about the first or second year of veterinary school, you take microbiology class, and they teach you about gram-positive bacteria and gram-negative bacteria. And those are distinguished based on the cell wall, differences in the cell wall of the bacteria. And that's important. It's important because it's important for antibiotic selection. Some antibiotics work better against gram-positives. Some work better against gram-negatives. Then you go along in veterinary school and you learn about contagious bacteria versus environmental bacteria. And that's important from a management standpoint. So contagious bacteria are transmitted in the parlor, and so our control measures are going to be in the parlor. Contagious bacteria being Streptococcus agalactiae, Staphylococcus aureus, and mycoplasmas. And there's a couple of these environmentals that can behave in a contagious way sometimes. But for the most part, the environmental bacteria are controlled in the 23 hours a day that the cow is not in the parlor, so in the cow's environment. But still, some of the things that we do in the parlor can influence whether bacteria on the teat end that the cow picked up in the environment ultimately enter the gland and cause mastitis. So then you graduate from veterinary school and you become a bovine veterinarian. And you work with dairy farmers. And over the years of veterinary practice, I started to view the bugs in terms of, can I kill it or can I not kill it, right? So staphs and streps, with the exception of Staph aureus, so most staphs and most streps, and certainly strep ag, we can kill. Things over here we're very unlikely to kill. And it turns out that the things that we can kill are all gram-positive bacteria. And then just one more way to think about these bacteria is sort of a three-compartment model, right? So there's bacteria like strep ag that are almost all in the milk, right? Strep ag is just in the milk. Staph aureus is both in the milk as well as the tissue. That's the key. It's in the tissue of the mammary gland. Staph aureus invades the tissue of the udder. And then we have E. coli that can escape out of the udder and affect the whole cow, right? So a three-compartment model for mastitis. And then it's important to remember that about 2 out of 3 mastitis cases will cure with no treatment. The cow has a very good, very effective immune system that fights off these bacteria in the mammary gland. And so about 2 out of 3 cases will go away with no treatment. So what that means is that if 60% go away with no treatment, then any treatment that we actually give must be measured against, is it better than 60%, right? We don't measure it as, did we cure her or did we not? We measure it as, is it better than 60%? So let's start into our questions. What about mastitis therapy during lactation? Should we treat a cow when she has mastitis? So this was looked at by Kessels et al., Journal of Dairy Science paper, where they compared different methods of treating a cow. And what they found was best was to do some sort of culture, some culture identification system, followed by treatment for specific bacteria or no treatment. But the second best model was just pick a tube, pick a mastitis treatment that treats gram-positive pathogens well. So let's look at that a little closer. So the best was identify the bacteria, and that basically means doing a culture plate. And there are several different ways to do that. There are biplates and triplates. So a biplate, for example, has one side of the plate only grows gram-positive, and the other side of the plate only grows gram-negative. So you get some milk and incubate it for 24 hours, and then the next morning, if it's a gram-positive, you treat. Or if it's a gram-negative and the cow is sick, you treat. But that's going to be a different treatment, right? It may or may not involve intramammary treatment. And we'll discuss that later. But for our gram-negatives and our no growth, we do not treat, right? And it's important, very important to note, so the first question you might have regarding that is, well, doesn't waiting 24 hours and letting those bacteria affect the cow for 24 hours, isn't that bad for the cow? And it turns out that it's not. Up to a 24-hour delay in treatment does not decrease clinical cures, and that's been looked at several times. Most best paper, though, is Alfonso Lago's paper down here. And you'll note as we go along that many of the references, things that I talk about, are down here in the bottom if you want to look up those papers. Anytime that I say something that's sort of my opinion that's not backed up by research, I'll try to point that out. I'll try to confine myself only to talking about things that are backed up by research. But the second best option was just pick a tube that treats gram-positive pathogens well, right? So don't do a culture, but just if you have a case of mastitis, use something that treats gram-positive well. And that's because gram-positive are the bacteria that we actually have a chance of treating successfully. So what about Staph aureus, right? So Staph aureus is kind of a difficult bug to treat. And that's because Staph aureus very commonly produces beta-lactamase. Beta-lactamase, sometimes called penicillinase, is an enzyme that breaks down the antibiotic before it can work. And Staph aureus produces that, or most Staph aureus produces that. But Staph aureus also forms these micro abscesses. That's why we talked about it being in the tissue of the udder as well as in the milk. So we put our antibiotic in the milk with a treatment tube, but it doesn't penetrate and get into the udder. And that's why Staph aureus is very difficult to cure. But this combination of being very difficult to cure, but also contagious from cow to cow, means Staph aureus is very bad bug to have. So the best thing to do with a Staph aureus cow is to cull her. But if you have 1,000 cows and you have 2 cows with Staph aureus, then you cull them immediately that day, immediately. But if you have 1,000 cows and you have 200 cows with Staph aureus, we can't really sell 20% of our herd. So the best thing to do is to segregate those cows into a special group and then milk them last. Many times it's been recommended to, if we have Staph aureus in our herd, to sanitize the milking unit, the claw between cows. And really that sounds like a good idea and sounds like it should work, to prevent spread of that Staph aureus that may be left on that milking unit, prevent spread to the next cow that gets milked with it. But most trials actually show very poor results. What I say, so this is a little bit of opinion here, but it's opinion based on evidence, is really the likelihood of cure for Staph aureus depends on how long that bacteria has been in her gland. If she just got Staph aureus in there 5 minutes ago and you put an antibiotic in there, you have a very good chance of eliminating Staph aureus from that cow. If that Staph aureus has been in that cow for 5 months, you have a very little to zero chance of curing Staph aureus. But we never know, right? When we find it, we don't know if she's a 5 minutes versus a 5 months cow, but we can guess, right? So if it's a first lactation cow, so she's in her first lactation and she's early in her first lactation and she gets mastitis for the first time, then those cows you might consider treating. Again, depending on the prevalence in your herd. If you don't have Staph aureus, then sell her too. But if it's an older cow and she's had mastitis before, she should probably be culled. And there's pretty good evidence. Some places in the southern United States, we actually have heifers come in at calving with Staph aureus, and treating those can sometimes be successful. So Staph aureus, it all depends, but you should generally think about it as incurable. And then what about coliforms, right? E. coli mastitis, gram-negative, Klebsiella, and E. coli. Really, with these are the bugs that are going to affect the whole cow. About 33% or more of Staph aureus cases have bacteremia. Bacteremia means emia means blood, so bacteria going on the whole bloodstream of the whole cow. So some of these cows deserve antibiotic therapy, and really very important to use anti-inflammatory. So phenidine or flunixin-meglumine, very important to fight the effects of endotoxin, right? So lipopolysaccharide in this cell wall of gram-negative bacteria is really, really bad for the cow. It's like a bomb. Very, very, part of the reason that I was successful as a bovine veterinarian is that cows are hard to kill, right? I would show up at a farm and almost no matter what I did, they got better. So I looked like a success. Well, that's because cows are very tough, very hard to kill. But this lipopolysaccharide endotoxin from E. coli mastitis can take a happy, healthy cow and make her dead the next day. It's very difficult to do that. And I say that as a story to illustrate how potent, how powerful this LPS or lipopolysaccharide or endotoxin is. So these cows deserve fluids. Typically, I would give 2 liters of hypertonic saline solution, and you have to also give water. Hypertonic saline does not do any good unless you also drench them with 5 to 10 gallons of water. They may need supplemental calcium, definitely need anti-inflammatories, phenidine, flunixin. And the other thing, we do typically put an antibiotic in the milk, in the udder, just because sometimes, it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, but it's not a duck. We think it's E. coli, but it turns out to be gram-positive. Now, another question, there are some companies in the United States that are promoting treating cows for more than 3 days, extended therapy. for 5 to 7 days of intramammary therapy. And the literature is kind of mixed on that. So there's not very good evidence that it works. There's a couple of papers that say it works, but several papers that say it doesn't do any more good than treating for 2 to 3 days. But we want to think it ought to work better. But the problem is, so what I will warn you is, almost any mastitis, the milk continues to look abnormal for 5 to 10 days, even if we've cured the bacteria. So even if our antibiotic has eliminated the bacteria from the milk, due to that inflammation in the gland, the milk still looks abnormal for 5 to 7 days. So if we treat for 5 to 7 days and the milk starts to look normal again in 5 to 7 days, it seems like that extended treatment worked. But that's really just a false conclusion. The bacteria were gone with the 2 to 3 day treatment. It's just that the milk started to look normal at about the same time that you stopped treatment with the extended treatment. So don't be fooled by that. So that kind of leads us right into the dry period, right? So what about the dry period with respect to mastitis in the next lactation? All the smart mastitis researchers that I know will tell you that most mastitis cases get started either very early in the dry period or very late in the dry period. And that's when all this mastitis in the early lactation actually got started back here in the dry period. And that was always hard for me to believe, right? So how can those bacteria get in there and then just kind of hang out and do nothing and cause mastitis all the way out at, say, 30 days in milk? But it turns out that that's really, really true. Here's another bit of evidence demonstrating that, right? So in fact, the red are infections that originated in the dry period, and the yellow are infections that originated during lactation. So a lot of mastitis actually got its start in the dry period. And that really can happen because when the mammary gland is dry during the dry period, there's no milk in there, at least in the middle of the dry period. So when there's very little milk and you have a lot of lactoferrin and high leukocyte or white blood cell concentrations, that can keep those bacteria in check. It doesn't completely eliminate them, but it keeps them in check until we have a lot of milk in there in the early lactation. And as you all know, milk is a wonderful medium to support bacterial growth. And so that's how that can happen. So that leads us into, why do we dry treat? So we dry treat basically for two reasons. The first is to cure existing subclinical infections, right? The milk looks normal, but she has maybe a coagulase negative staph or a strep in there that's subclinical, but we're curing those existing subclinical infections with our dry treatment. Or the other reason to dry treat is to prevent new infections in the early dry period. And this would be only in the early dry period, right? Because this antibiotic isn't going to last all the way until this period, just before the next lactation. And what I'm going to argue is that this is almost all the reason why we dry treat cows, to cure existing subclinical infections. The real way, the real way to prevent new infections is to, first of all, not put cows in something that looks like this, right? There's no way to prevent infections in the dry period if cows have bad housing. Second of all, we know that milk leakage with that teat end open leaves the mammary gland susceptible to infection. So it's some producers with cows over about 60 pounds, so say maybe 25 to 30 liters of milk per day. If a cow's giving more than that, then for 5 to 7 days prior to dry off, they'll house those cows separately and put them on a very low energy diet to try to decrease their milk production prior to dry off, basically to prevent milk leakage at dry off. And then finally, using a teat sealant. And we use a teat sealant because a very high proportion of quarters, these are 3 separate studies, So in this study, at about 10 days after dry off, 70% of the quarters had not formed a keratin plug and were still open. And even on into the dry period, 1 in 5 quarters, midway through the dry period, 40, even close to the full dry period, 10 out of 100 quarters are still open and leaking milk. And so they didn't form a keratin seal to keep bacteria out. And so that's why using a teat sealant is a good idea. And I realize that MSD does not sell a teat sealant, so hopefully you will give me some credibility for promoting another company's product in Mexico. But using a teat sealant is really a good idea, whether it comes from MSD or not. So, but what we're really doing, so these are the ways to prevent new infections. Remember, right? We said we're doing two things. We're curing existing and preventing new infections. Well, so these are the things we do to prevent new infections. Mostly what we're doing at dry off is curing those existing infections, right? So really, we want to use a treatment that's going to kill those gram-positive bugs that we have a chance of curing. And really, so nafpenzal is a wonderful choice for that, right? That has an antibiotic in there that's going to kill those existing subclinical infections. So let's look at some research on dry cow therapy. So in this Aruda study, they looked at about 1,000 cows, 4,000 quarters in 6 different herds, and 80%, 4 out of 5 cows had no growth. 20% they grew a bacteria at dry off, but almost all of these 20%, 80% of those were a gram positive. And they looked at 3 different antibiotics, and you can tell from the, what's in here, either cefaclorin or penicillin streptomycin or ceftiofur. So you can probably guess what dry treatments those are. There was no difference between the 3 tubes. The point being that ceftiofur is really, and the streptomycin in this drug are really directed, again, this one's directed against both gram-positive and gram-negative. This is directed against gram-negative. Really, this backs up what I've told you, that really what we have a chance of curing is the gram-positive. So there were no difference between the 3 tubes in cure rate. No difference in a new infection rate, and no difference in chronics. Also no difference in somatic cell count or clinical mastitis in the next lactation or milk production in the next lactation. So use a dry tube that treats gram-positive as well. Andy Johnson, a very famous mastitis guru in the United States, also did a similar study, looked at about 800 cows, 3,000 quarters, a little more, about 1 out of 3 cows had an infection at dry off, but almost all gram-positive. And they looked at cloxacillin versus ceftiofur, and again, no difference between the 2 tubes for cure rate over the dry period, new infection rate, clinical mastitis in the next lactation, or milk production or components in the next lactation. So pick a dry tube that is effective against gram-positives. So what about selective dry cow therapy? Particularly in Europe, there are some countries where they absolutely, by government law, must do selective dry cow therapy. And that's not the case in the US, it's not the case in Mexico. But everywhere, there's, anytime we use an antibiotic in every cow, that just doesn't sound right? We'd rather avoid using an antibiotic in every cow. But having said that, I must point out this, and that is that this has been studied as to whether dry treatment leads to antimicrobial resistance. And certainly anytime we use an antibiotic, we have the potential to select for bacteria that are resistant, right? Antibiotics do not create resistance. They merely select for the bacteria that are already resistant. But dry cow therapy has never been shown to lead to resistance among pathogens. So what about internal motivation, right? In the United States, we have very little strep ag. And strep ag is a very good reason to dry treat. But, so if we don't have strep ag, then we could do selective dry cow therapy. But conversely, I will point out that a huge part of the reason that we don't have strep ag is because we have dry treated every quarter of every cow for so many years. But then the other reason is, that Aruda study pointed out that 80% of quarters were no growth, right? Why spend the money treating 80% of quarters when 4 out of 5 quarters don't have any bugs in them, right? So we can save money through selective dry cow therapy. And it certainly can work very well. Definitely selective dry cow therapy can work. But the difficult part is selecting which cows to treat and which cows not to treat, right? So that's what selective dry cow therapy is. We're only going to treat the cows that we think have a bacteria in the udder. So the first criteria is your herd somatic cell count less than, or the bulk tank somatic cell count less than about 200,000. If you have a bulk tank somatic cell count that's 400,000, then you really should not consider selective dry cow therapy. You probably have some contagious staphs or streps, and you really need to get that under control before you do selective dry cow therapy. But if we decide to do it, then typically the criteria are that the last test somatic cell count. So you have to be on test too, right? You have to have somatic cell counts for the cows, for each cow. So if that cow's last test was greater than 200,000, you should treat. And you might use a differential, right? So lactation 1, you might use a threshold of 200,000 and use a lower threshold for older cows, lactation 2 plus. And this can be an and or a or, right? So if she's more than 200,000 and she had more than 2 cases of mastitis during lactation, or you could say, is she more than 200,000 or did she have more than 2 cases of mastitis during lactation? Then we're going to treat her. Some people have looked at rapid culturing. So what I said about treating cows during lactation, but it really becomes just practically difficult to get all those cows you're going to dry off tomorrow in today and do a culture. It leads to a lot of cultures, and it's just not practical to do on a farm. So, and I'm going to show you some evidence that an algorithm like using criteria like this works as well as culture anyway. But if you are this is very, 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 very important. Mucho importante. You must use a teat sealant if you're going to do selective dry cow therapy. So for cows that you don't treat, you have to use a teat sealant. And I will point out, so here's the study, this Rowe et al. in Preventive Veterinary Medicine Journal, just came out in 2020, that said an algorithm, so just basing it on somatic cell count and other criteria, is just as good as a culture and deciding which cows to treat and which cows not to treat. But it's important to remember, one of the primary things is we have to have that somatic cell count data for individual cows. And we always need to remember that a somatic cell count on an individual cow is already an average by definition, because cows have 4 quarters. And so that cow somatic cell count is an average of those 4 quarters, right? So if she has quarter 1 is 190, quarter 2 is 190, 190, 190, then her somatic cell count is 190,000. But she could have 3 quarters at 50,000 and 1 quarter that really needs to be treated at 610,000, and this averages out to still 190, right? So on a selective dry cow therapy program, this cow would not be treated, and yet she has 1 quarter that really should have been treated. So just always remember that somatic cell counts on a cow basis are always an average, and averages can be deceiving. So, and I'll just stay on this slide for a minute. These are all the studies, or many of the studies. These aren't all the studies, but many of the studies on selective dry cow therapy, if you want to go to the literature and look it up. This Winder study is a meta-analysis of several studies, so that would maybe be the one to go to first if you're thinking about selective dry cow therapy. And this Rowe study was the one I just spoke about, looking at the algorithm versus culture. So what about vaccination? I'm not even going to talk about Staph aureus vaccination because it's not recommended. There's very little evidence to support it and pretty good evidence to discourage Staph aureus vaccination. But we're going to talk a little bit about vaccination against strep uberis, Klebsiella, and E. coli. So what about strep uberis or Streptococcus uberis? There is a new vaccine from Spain called UBAC, and there is some evidence to support this UBAC vaccine. So this is Journal of Dairy Science, very recent, 2018, and this is a challenge study. So this is not a field exposure study. They actually put strep uberis, and it was a different strain than what was in the vaccine, but they put strep uberis in these cows' quarters. So they challenged them with strep uberis. But the vaccinated cows had fewer cows had clinical signs of mastitis, they had lower rectal temperature, and they had less of a milk yield decrease after the challenge. And the vaccination increased the number of quarters where they had no growth after challenge, and increased the number of quarters where the somatic cell count stayed under 200,000. So, my dad always used to say, yes, but it stood the test of time, right? I once had a very good dairy producer who I worked for. He was a client who said that a good dairyman never wants to be the first person to try something new, but he also never wants to be the last person to try something new, right? If you're the first person trying new things, then you'll go broke trying new things. But if you're the last person trying new things, then you're going to be below average because you're not going to stay with the latest technology. So I would say that this vaccine shows promise, but that it hasn't stood the test of time quite yet. There's also a strep uberis vaccine here in the United States made by a company called Hygieia, but there's no evidence to support the use of this vaccine, so I just can't really recommend it until I see some actual evidence. And it's important to note that with respect to strep uberis, disinfection of teats pre-milking and only applying the milker to dry teats is very effective at decreasing Streptococcus uberis. So how we prep these cows before milking can greatly decrease strep uberis, right? We all want that simple thing. Just give them a vaccine and then I don't have to do the hard work in the parlor. Well, if you do things right in the parlor, you won't have strep uberis problems. What about Klebsiella? So there is a vaccine in the U.S. called Klebvax, and again, it's pretty new, so it hasn't stood the test of time. I know of several dairies that are using it, and Pat Gordon, who's a very smart mastitis guy at Iowa State, did a study, vaccinates versus controls, and this is a field study. There was no challenge. They just went into a dairy and did it. Now, it's important, very important to note that the dairy where they did this study had a very high Klebsiella mastitis challenge. This is a dairy that was having Klebsiella mastitis problems. But, on that dairy, they saw very good results from this vaccine. They decreased the risk of Klebsiella mastitis by almost 80%. Almost 2 kilos or 2 liters more milk per day in vaccinated cows, and reduced the somatic cell count by more than half in the vaccinated cows. So that's, very, very good results to support that. But you have to remember that this was done in a herd that had severe Klebsiella problems. If you don't have a big Klebsiella problem, your results might not look this good. Now, what about good old J5? J5 E. coli mastitis J5 vaccination. Very good evidence to support that J5 is something that we should do. If you're not using a J5 vaccine, you should start. But, J5 is a vaccine. We have to give 3 doses for it to work. And they're not cheap. So it becomes about a $10 per cow investment. So if we're making a big monetary money investment in 3 doses of J5, we should probably make sure we're doing it correctly. So to start with, stimulating immunity versus E. coli is difficult to start with. And this is a vaccine that we have to give 3 doses every year to just get 50 to 75 days worth of immunity, or 50 to 80 days worth of protection. 3 doses. So it's really hard to get an immune response from this vaccine. So just looking, and this is just my little drawing here, right? But we give a vaccine, and this is antibody or immunity on the y-axis and time over here on the x-axis. We give any vaccine, what we expect to happen is we get more immunity that rises quickly and then falls off slowly, right? So that's just any vaccine. And the reason we give a booster is we want to, right up here when this is peaking, we want to give another dose so we get a higher peak and then a longer tail. That's just basic vaccines, vaccinology 101. But what could happen, and this is obviously, this slide is exaggerated. Please don't believe this is what happens if you space your J5 vaccines out too far. But if you do, if you wait too long to get a booster, and this is we need to be above this dotted line to get protection. If you wait too long between vaccines, your curves could look more like this than what we really want. We want to look like this, right? We want to give the next dose when this is at its peak, so we keep climbing and get a much higher immunity, better immunity, and longer tail. So the moral of this story is, right, typically we give J5 a dry off, and if we have a 60-day dry period and a 21-day pre-fresh period, that's 40 days in between doses. And that's probably too long. It's not this bad, but really we could do better. We want it to look more like this. And this comes when you give vaccines about 21 to 28 days apart. Now, Ron Erskine did a study where he actually gave 5 doses. Ron Erskine is at Michigan State, and they gave these vaccines 28 days apart, and they actually were able to do this and get even greater immunity. And I want you to remember this, though, because I'm not recommending this. Let me say that very slowly and clearly. I do not recommend this. But remember this when we discuss, a lot of people will give these 3 doses here, and then because they see E. coli mastitis out here at like 100 to 200 days in milk, and they'll want to give a 4th dose out here. And I'll show you the contrast between this, what I'm going to show you. And this is the actual data from Ron Erskine's study, where these are the cows that got 5 doses. And these are the cows, actually, they gave it in multiple locations. So they gave the first dose in one side of the neck, the next dose in the other side of the neck, the next dose, I think, behind the front leg, right front leg, the 4th dose behind the left front leg. So they moved it around, and that actually did better than this, where they gave all 5 doses in the same place in the left side of the neck. So that's some evidence that moving where you give the shot might make a difference too. But they all did better, had longer immunity than just the 3-dose cows as well. But this is the point, right? So if we give our 3 doses, but then we wait to 100, 150 days in milk, we're probably wasting our money by giving a 4th dose by itself. That's the point. So I show all this to illustrate it's probably not useful to give a 4th dose out at 100 to 200 days in milk. So the take-home messages with respect to J5 are, number 1, give all 3 doses. Regardless of the product label, there are some vaccines that are labeled to be given only 2 doses. Even no matter what the label is, I recommend 3 doses. And I recommend particularly the first 2 doses to be given 21 to 28 days between the first and second dose. You can get a little longer between the second and third dose, but try to keep it down close to 28 days. We talked about altering the location may help, and we talked about this phenomenon of single doses out late in lactation by themselves probably don't work. Think of like an OVSINC, right? In our repro protocols, Dr. Fricke's going to visit with you and Dr. Giordano, very smart guys. But we all know if we're not going to give the shots at the right time in an OVSINC, then we probably shouldn't start the program at all. And giving J5 is kind of like OVSINC. You really need to give, if you're going to do it, you should do it right. So finally, what about the future? You know, all of the latest, not all, much, there is a whole bunch of research nowadays on the microbiome. The microbiome is the organisms, the bacteria that live inside of our gut and on other surfaces. So in our nose and in our eyes, right? There's a resident microflora of bacteria, and that's normal. A normal bacteria live in those places. There are actually more, as if you count the number of bacteria cells living in your body, and you just do it by cells, there are more bacterial cells in your body than there are human cells. So large numbers of bacteria in your gut and on your skin and your eyes, etc. And in humans, in the human mammary gland, they have shown that there are resident bacteria that live there all the time. In a lactating, and also a non-lactating human female. And there's actually evidence that these bacteria get there somehow. They get to the mammary gland from the gut. They enter the mammary gland through the body, and then from the gut they get to the mammary gland. And there's some evidence that actually, so human females get mastitis. That happens. Humans can get mastitis, and there's some evidence that giving bacteria with normal bacteria into the mammary gland to displace the abnormal bacteria that are causing the mastitis is a more effective treatment than antibiotic therapy in human mastitis. Now, what about cows, right? That's what we care about. We like cows. So there's far less evidence for this normal. You know, we used to think that the bovine mammary gland was sterile, right? In the absence, should be in a normal cow, there should be no bacteria. And that's probably closer to true. We talked about humans where there are resident population of normal flora. Far less evidence that is true in cows. In fact, there's some evidence directly to the contrary that the mammary gland should in fact be sterile and no bacteria in there. But there is a little bit of evidence for resident bacteria in the cow mammary gland. So we'll have to wait for more research on that. But the microbiome, this normal population of bacteria, is really interesting research, and there will be a lot of work in the future on that. And so with that, I will say gracias, muchas gracias to my Latin American colleagues, and I will be happy to answer any questions. I actually grew up with beef cattle. That is one of my cows, and you see the steam there from her nose. The high temperature that day was about, I'm going to say about minus 20 Celsius. So, questions?
Thank you, Dr. Lowell. Thank you very much for this presentation, Dr. Lowell. It was excellent. And yes, we have some questions. The first question is, could we use tilmycin parenterally as a support of the antibiotic tube? This is from Dr. Noé.
Yeah, so the question was, should we use systemic antibiotics at the same time as intramammary antibiotics? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, hold on one second. I'm going to unmute you here so I can hear you better. Yeah, so good question. In general, I would not recommend that. So we're going to talk about a couple of specific cases. So I would recommend that in the case of E. coli mastitis, right? We talked about 25 or 33% to 50% of E. coli cases, there is bacteremia, where the bacteria are floating around the whole cow. So yes, I would recommend systemic antibiotics in the case of E. coli. That, but remember, that antibiotic doesn't have to get into the mammary gland. Not all antibiotics penetrate into the tissue of the mammary gland or the milk, into the milk. When in the case of the E. coli cow, we're giving that antibiotic to treat the rest of the cow. Some antibiotics do penetrate into the mammary gland. There were several studies. Ken Leslie did a study in Canada at the University of Guelph where they looked at using, I think it was Thailand, in addition to dry treatment to cure Staph aureus cows. And the systemic antibiotic group did no better at curing Staph aureus. In fact, and there are other studies looking specifically at Staph aureus, combining injectable antibiotics with intramammary antibiotics, and none of those were better than intramammary antibiotics alone. So broadly and generally, that has been looked at and researched, and treating with systemic antibiotics is no better than intramammary alone.
Well, Dr. Noé is saying that he wants to know specifically with tilmycin. Do you know?
Yes, tilmycin, yes. Yeah, so specifically with respect to tilmycin, that's Micatil, and that is a very similar antibiotic to tylosin, and that's why, in fact, I think that it's been studied with tilmycin as well with Staph aureus, and no benefit. So the original Ken Leslie study used tylosin, and tylosin and tilmycin, again, are both macrolides, very similar antibiotics. And I think there's a study as well, as I recall, using tilmycin as well. Now, this is looking at Staph aureus, which is a really hard bug to treat, right? But still, no benefit from systemic therapy over just intramammary.
Thank you, Dr. Lowell. We have another question. When you were talking of J5, you mentioned to move the location and that will be benefit. What do you mean? Or why, if you change location of the application of the vaccine, is beneficial?
Yes, and sorry, I have to lean down because I have my phone is where I'm getting the audio from, and I have it turned down so that I don't hear the translation as well at the same time. So the question was regarding moving the location of the injection of the J5 vaccine. Why did that work? And I didn't do that study. Ron Erskine did that study. Again, a very smart mastitis researcher at Michigan State University. I don't know what motivated them to try that, but it did certainly seem to work, right? In those graphs, the group that got the first injection, I think, was in the left side of the neck, second injection in the right side of the neck, third injection behind the right front leg, fourth behind the left front leg, and fifth was back to the left side of the neck. I don't know why they decided to test that, but it certainly did look better, I agree. And I don't know that anyone knows why, right? But that won't stop me from guessing, right? So I'll give you a guess. So here's my guess. Cows get a lot of shots, and every time you get a shot, a vaccination, there's inflammation. And the more inflammation you get in a certain area, you're always going to end up with a little bit of scar tissue in the long term. And scar tissue is not as reactive as a good, healthy subcutaneous tissue. And so that might be, it might have to, and so maybe due to less scar tissue at the site of the second, third, fourth, and fifth injection. It could also be that it's useful to stimulate a different lymph node. So always remember the immune system, immunity happens at lymph nodes. Everything has to get, so an antigen presenting cell picks up that foreign thing and takes it to a lymph node, and it has to go to the lymph node to get the immune system started. So it could be that going to different lymph nodes instead of the same one all the time helps as well. I don't know. Those are the first two reasons that come to mind, but those are just my guesses. It would require further study to find out the true answer.
Thank you, Dr. Lowell. Another question. What do you think of using double tubes for those cows that are dry for more than 3 months? Or what do you recommend to do in these cases?
Yeah, so the question was, should we use double tubes in cows that are dry for more than 3 months? And so definitely I do not recommend, there's no reason to use more than one tube at the time of dry off, right? I would not recommend that. One tube, there should be enough medication in one tube. And certainly that's extra label. You're going off the label. So I'm not going to recommend an extra label treatment. But there's no reason to think that would be better, really. And really what we're doing, it doesn't depend on the length of the dry period. Remember, mostly what we're doing is curing existing subclinical infections, right? So the effect of that antibiotic isn't really going to last longer if we use 2 tubes. Now, one thing you could have meant is giving 1 tube at dry off and then waiting like halfway through the dry period and treating them again. And I definitely, no, would not recommend that at all, because hopefully, now I showed you a slide that said that many cows do not develop an effective keratin plug. But if that cow did develop an effective keratin plug, then putting a tube in there is going to disrupt that. And so if you have a keratin plug, that's the best preventive for new infections in the dry period. So there's no circumstance that I can think of that I could recommend two tubes when drying a cow off.
Thank you, Dr. Lowell. Another question. What do you think of the extended therapy for the treatment of Streptococcus suberis?
Yeah, so the question was extended therapy for the treatment of Streptococcus uberis. So the research is variable on that question of extended therapy. If there was a bug that might be responsive to extended therapy, Strep uberis would be a good candidate. So and that's just my thought, right? Based on what I know about the bug. So Streptococcus uberis would be a good candidate for extended therapy. But again, when it's been researched, very few trials have found evidence that it's a good idea. And several trials have shown no benefit to extended therapy. And I remind you again of what I said during the lecture, which is, so mastitis, it ends, mast means mammary gland, and itis means inflammation. That's where we get mastitis, inflammation of the mammary gland. And that's, so when we see that abnormal milk, that is evidence of inflammation of the mammary gland, not necessarily evidence of a bacteria. Now, 99% of the time when we see signs of mastitis, there's a bacteria there. So don't misunderstand. But that abnormal milk signs of mastitis almost always continues for 5 to 10 days, whether or not the bacteria have been cured. And so just because, so if we do extended therapy, it looks like the milk got back to normal at about the time we quit. That doesn't mean that the first 2 doses didn't cure the bacteria. So yes, I mean, it does make sense. If I were going to pick one bug that I would maybe think about extended therapy, Strep uberis might be a pretty good candidate for it. But the research just doesn't support it.
Thank you, Dr. Lowell. Another question. Is there any breed of cattle that is more prone to have mastitis?
Yeah, so the question was, is there any breed of cattle that is more prone to mastitis? And that is a very good question to which I do not know the answer. And I've never looked. I'm sure that someone has looked at that. So I encourage you, the person who asked that question, to go to the literature to try to find out, because I'm almost sure someone has looked at that. It's just I've never thought of evaluating that. And the only thing I will say is, in my experience over 24 years as a practicing veterinarian, I never noticed any difference between herds as far as resistance to mastitis. I mean, when I say between herds, I really mean between breeds, as far as resistance to mastitis. So really good question, and I don't know. But I'll bet you that research is out there, and you could find out. Or ask your veterinarian or ask your MSD person to look it up in the literature, because I'll bet someone has looked.
Thank you, Dr. Lowell. A question of Dr. Oscar. What do you recommend to a farm that have a somatic cell count of 700,000 having Staph aureus? These bacteria keep the count very high in the bulk tank. What do you recommend?
Yes, so the question is a herd that has a 700,000 somatic cell count, and they do know that they have Staph aureus. Yeah, so that's a tough one. Any cow that is a culture positive Staph aureus cow, that she should be considered to have Staph aureus for life. Once a staph cow, always a staph cow. And basically, so if we were playing baseball, that cow would have 2 strikes, right? And if she gets a 3rd strike, so if she gets lame, or she is a low producer, or even if she just wiggles her ear funny, that will be the 3rd strike, and she should be culled. Second, I would have a group. I would have cows grouped by known staph positive cows and known staph negative cows. And the staph positive cows should be last. That group should be milked last. And the staph negative cows, and also the first lactation cows, should be milked first. And try over time to eliminate the staph positive cows and keep the staph negative cows clean from staph. That is what I would do, but it's very difficult. And obviously with 700,000, they have lots of staph cows. And they can't cull all them today, but they can. It's a very long process, but they can work toward a clean herd. And then the other thing I will say is they really, really, really need to tighten up their parlor procedure. Make sure all their procedures, teat dipping in the parlor, is done correctly on every cow, every time. And finally, the milkers should wear latex or nitrile gloves, because Staph aureus can get on the milkers' hands. So they need to wear gloves in the parlor. No bare hand should ever touch a cow teat on that farm. So that's a tough one. That farm needs to work with their veterinarian and work with their MSD representative, and get some mastitis guru consultants in there and also watch their machine function. Make sure their milking machine is functioning properly as well. So that's a long road to go down, but they need to start down the road today.
Thank you, Dr. Lowell. A question of Dr. Fernandez. What is coming in the future? What MSD is looking for in the pipeline to make a revolution in the milk quality area?
Yeah, so the question was, what is MSD looking at as far as what is in our pipeline for in the milk quality area? So very good question. So in the United States, we have a teat sealant. So Zoetis had the first teat sealant, Orbiseal, and they had the patent. But that patent has expired in the United States and in many countries. And so many different companies have a teat sealant, and we have one as well. And that's so as we discussed, particularly if you're doing selective dry cow therapy, but even if you're not, teat sealants worked. They should be used. So we have a teat sealant, so that should be coming to Mexico hopefully soon. Around the globe, MSD markets a variety of different mastitis treatment tubes, intramammary tubes, and so I don't know what may or may not be coming to Mexico. But really, honestly, if you don't remember anything else from this lecture, remember that mastitis is not fixed by vaccines or magic antibiotics. Mastitis is fixed by doing the things that we all know need to be done with prepping cows, preparing cows properly for milking, so only milking clean, dry teats, post-milking teat dipping every cow every time, eliminating subclinical infections through dry treatment, and culling cows that are chronic. That we had a question about Staph aureus and Staph aureus herd. They really need to be aggressive at culling in that herd. We really need, because those cows are by definition chronics, and we need to cull chronic cows. So just doing the things that are very simple, but even though they're simple, they're hard to do. But doing those things properly is really the key. There's no panacea or magic bullets. We really just need to do the basics well, and that's the most important thing for mastitis.
Thank you, Dr. Lowell. We have a question. Why there are no treatments if there's no growth in the cultures of gram-negatives in the samples?
Yeah, so really good question. So the question was, why is there sometimes no growth? And truly, it's about a quarter to a third of the time that the samples yield no growth. And there can be several reasons for that. But the most common is, remember, so I'll give you two examples of why there can be no growth. The first one is, remember we said about 2 out of 3 mastitis cases cure on their own, right? The cow has an immune response and she eliminates the bacteria on her own, 2 out of 3 cases. So maybe that has already happened by the time you catch it. So that gets back to the discussion we had on the difference, mastitis being really what we see as clinically abnormal milk. So we see that clinically abnormal milk, but the cow has already had an immune response and eliminated the bacteria. The other very common reason why we can have a no growth is that it's a coliform, an E. coli. E. coli are like we have sprinters and we have distance runners, right? So Staph aureus is the marathon runner. It stays in there for a long time. But E. coli is the 100 meters. They go really fast for 100 meters and can even kill the cow with all that endotoxin, but they burn out really quickly. So many Staph aureus are gone within 24 hours. of the infection. So that's another reason that you have a no growth, is that it was a gram-negative E. coli, and it is truly already gone. But again, the milk looks really, really abnormal because of all that endotoxin that it released as it was dying. So we see what looks like mastitis, abnormal milk, for a long time, but the E. coli is gone. So those are two reasons why you can have a no growth. And again, it is common that about a quarter to a third of samples yield no growth, and that's normal. And I guess I would add to that, this is a question that wasn't asked, but I would strongly recommend that every dairy farm have some sort of culturing program. And you can work with your veterinarian to set up what works for you. I mean, so an example would be once a month, you culture 10 high somatic cell count cows, or 1% of the herd, or 5% of the herd, whatever number. Let's say if you have a 1,000 cow dairy, you might culture 20 cows once a month, just your highest somatic cell count cows. Or you can culture cows at freshening. Many dairies do that, do a culture at freshening. Or you can culture clinical cases. So every time you have a clinical case, before she's treated, you take a sample and you put it in the freezer. Take a sample, label it with the cow ID, put it in the freezer, and then treat her. And then, once a week or once a month when the vet comes, you give those samples to the vet and they do cultures. So I don't care what culturing system you decide to do, but periodically some cows should be cultured to find out what the problem bugs are on your farm. That Staph aureus herd that we talked about, if they had been doing that years ago, I'll bet you they wouldn't have near so many Staph aureus cows as they have now. Because they would know they had Staph aureus, and they would have been more aggressive at treating and eliminating, or I should say just eliminating the Staph aureus back then. So have a culture program.
Thank you. A question from Maria Paula. What treatment do you recommend when you have mastitis for a gram-positive bacteria, and that it would be effective, and why you will choose that antibiotic?
Yeah, so the question was, what treatment do I recommend for gram-positive bacteria? And basically, I would recommend a tube that contains either penicillin or a cousin of penicillin, what we call extended spectrum penicillin. So amoxicillin, ampicillin. So penicillins are the treatment of choice for streps for sure, or a cephalosporin type antibiotic. So either a penicillin or a cephalosporin would be my treatment of choice for gram-positive bacteria. And really penicillin being a little bit better than cephalosporin, but it probably really doesn't matter. But some tube that treats a gram-positive well. So that would be penicillin or amoxicillin or ampicillin or some penicillin type drug or a cephalosporin.
Dr. Lowell, which is your advice for the producers that want to implement a good production system involving diseases, economy, and animal welfare too?
So I'm not sure I caught the question in there. The question was, what advice do I have for producers that want to both
Yes,
make money economically and also achieve
exactly.
good animal welfare? Is that the question?
And yes, and animal welfare too.
Sure. So I truly believe strongly that animal welfare and economic success are not working against each other. I think that when you achieve good animal welfare, that makes you more likely to achieve economic success. So all the things that we do with respect to udder health, but also with respect to lameness, with respect to cow comfort, with respect to the cow's environment, a nice sand-bedded free stall, or clean dry lot. Almost all the things that I can think of that benefit animal welfare are also going to benefit us economically. So I think both support each other and can be achieved simultaneously. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Dr. Lowell. We have more questions. Why, if we have mastitis, you could see that until 30 days?
Yeah, so if I understand the question correctly, sometimes this farm or this producer sees mastitis that lasts for 30 days. Is that correct? Did I get that right?
Yes.
Yeah, good question. I don't know. That might make me start thinking about something that's impossible to cure, right? So we talked about prototheca, which is an algae. It's not even a bacteria. We talked about yeast that can cause mastitis. Some of those, and those can become chronic and are incurable. There is no treatment. They are incurable. So that could lead to that. If you have a case that is going for 30 days, I would strongly recommend that you stop treatment and then wait at least 10 days and then do a culture to find out what you're dealing with and send it to a good lab and tell them, that you're looking for mycoplasma and prototheca and those types of bugs that can get in there and establish themselves and become, chronic. But we need to get an identification on that bug because, typically from a bacterial cause of mastitis, it's not going to last 30 days, right? So we need to find out what's causing that in that animal.
There's a question. When you finish the mastitis treatment, the clinical mastitis with with a tube, should we have to wait that the milk has lower than 200,000 cells, or when you will be expecting to have a drop in the somatic cell count?
Yeah, so very good question. The question was, when we finish treatment with antibiotic mastitis tube, how quickly does the somatic cell count return down to normal? And it takes a while. It definitely takes a while. And it's somewhat dependent upon the bacteria that caused the mastitis. But it's not uncommon for a somatic cell count to stay high for a couple of weeks. Again, remember, somatic cell count is a manifestation. Somatic cell count is the white blood cells that come to fight the bacteria. And even when the bacteria are gone, that inflammation that drew those white blood cells into the quarter is going to stay there for a while. So again, it depends a little bit on the bacteria. With Staph aureus, maybe it's going to stay high for a long time. And that's probably because there's still bacteria there. But even if all the bacteria are gone, it's going to take weeks to even a month or so for the somatic cell count to come all the way back down to below 200,000.
Thank you, Dr. Lowell. We have another question. Could you give me your opinion regarding mycoplasma? For example, we have many clinical cases caused by mycoplasma. What could you tell us?
Yeah, so the question was about mycoplasma. We have a farm with many clinical cases due to mycoplasma. And I will tell you right now, I am not a mycoplasma expert. Where I practiced in the United States, we rarely saw mycoplasma. But so what I'm telling you is what I know, just from the literature and from what colleagues have told me. So don't believe everything I say with respect to mycoplasma. But in the southeastern U.S., so Florida, Georgia, where it's warm and moist, they see mycoplasma. And, where I practiced in the northeast U.S., if we saw mycoplasma, we would cull that cow right now, get her out of the herd, because mycoplasma is contagious at milking time. And we did not want to see any more cases because it, just like Staph aureus, it's both contagious and we thought incurable, right? So, and it is incurable insofar as there's no antibiotic that treats it very well, right? So antibiotics do not work for mycoplasma. So if I saw mycoplasma in the Northeast, we would cull that cow immediately. On the other hand, my colleagues in the Southeast U.S. tell me that those cows can self-cure. Many of those cows can self-cure. So they would isolate that cow. Hopefully, many herds in the Southeast have a special parlor for the hospital pen for the treated cows. And they would take that cow to a special parlor where there's only treated cows. So to decrease the likelihood that it's going to spread from her to other cows in the lactating herd. And they would keep her there. And many of those cows, they tell me, will self-cure. I don't know. Again, I don't have a lot of experience with mycoplasma, but I know there's no magic antibiotic for it. And then probably more important than anything that I've said so far is really what you need to do, again, with mycoplasma. I know I've said this many times during this lecture, but you need to tighten up your parlor procedure. Prevent it from getting in there in the first place, and also milking machine function, right? We know that mycoplasma on the outside of the mammary gland gains access during milking when you have backflow of milk into the udder during milking from an improperly functioning machine, or a squawking, one inflation is squawking, letting air in, or a unit falls off one of the cows in the parlor, and so all the cows have back jets of milk. So milking machine function and tighten up parlor prep and post-dip procedures are really the way to stop getting mycoplasma and stop its spread. But so that's what I know about mycoplasma, but I am not a mycoplasma expert by any means. Just because in practice I never dealt with it much.
Thank you, Dr. Lowell. We have another question from Colombia, from Juan Carlos. Which is your recommendation for cases of microabscesses in the mammary gland? Some people try that quarter to avoid the proliferation of these bacteria.
Yeah, so the question was microabscesses due to Staph aureus in the mammary gland, and what about is drying that quarter up and not milking it? That is in fact a good solution. There's as long as you can get that quarter to dry up without it, becoming a problem from those, if those Staph aureus microabscesses stay there, they can potentially eventually make a sick cow. But yeah, that has been tried. There's a couple of studies. I would honestly, I would be very careful about making sure that the other 3 quarters were also clean on that cow. Because if she has Staph aureus in one of the other quarters, then she's still going to be contagious toward her herd mates. So I would do some repeat culturing on that cow to be sure the other quarters are clean. But yeah, that can work to dry up one of the quarters in a staph cow. There's some danger with it, but it can work. But again, to me, I would be very careful about assuming that the other 3 quarters were clean from Staph aureus. I'd really rather just cull that cow.
Thank you. We have a question here that says that what we could do with cows that are resistant to antibiotics or cows that are persistent, continuously having mastitis cases.
Yeah, so I would refer you back to one in 1970, the 5-point mastitis plan. One of the 5 points of the 5-point mastitis plan is to cull chronic cows. If you have cows that are chronic, there are plenty of heifers that are coming in with clean udders to replace her. Don't hang on to that cow just because her name is Rosa, and you love that cow. Take her. She can get a new career. She can get a career change from being a milk cow to being a beef cow, and she will be very tasty as a beef cow, and that's where she should go.
Thank you, Doctor. We have another question. What would you recommend to increase a cure rate of existing infections? And it is worthy to treat subclinical infections?
Yeah, so the question was increasing cure rate of clinical mastitis and treating subclinical infections. Really, that's why dry treatment is so important, because that's when we're going to clean up, hopefully, those subclinical infections, right? So at the end of the lactation, we don't have to take her out of the tank. We're going to clean up those subclinical infections with a dry cow therapy, dry treatment at the time of dry off. As far as increasing the cure rate of clinical cases during lactation, we've been trying to do that for 100 years. So, if you come up with the magic drug to do that, please call me first, because you and I are going to make a lot of money. I don't think there is a special drug that is going to increase the rate of clinical cure during lactation. So again, it really brings us back again. I hate to keep saying the same thing, but we'd rather prevent the cow from getting mastitis in the first place by doing things right in the parlor, and T-tipping, and parlor prep, and milking machine, and environment, bedding management. Let's prevent those infections in the first place, rather than trying to increase our success in treating them. But again, if you come up with a good way to treat them that's going to increase the success, please call me, because you and I are going to make a lot of money selling that.
Thank you, Dr. Lowell. Another question. Do you recommend any immunity stimulant or vitamins plus the antibiotic treatment?
Yes. So, very good question. Do I recommend an immune stimulant or vitamin along with antibiotic treatment? Broadly and generally, no. But I do have, there's a couple of very important things with respect to that, though. There's very good evidence out of Ohio State University, and this is 20-year-old evidence, even older than that, from Dr. Bill Weiss and Dr. Joe Hogan and Dr. Larry Smith, did several studies looking at vitamin E supplementation during the dry period and E. coli mastitis and all mastitis in early lactation. And, I'm a veterinarian. I'm not a nutritionist, so I can't tell you how many units of vitamin E to feed. I think it was 2,000, but don't quote me on that. But supplementation of vitamin E during the dry period and early lactation diet showed a very protective effect on mastitis, as well as other things like metritis, infection in the uterus. So very good to uh, so vitamin E supplementation works. Now, vitamin E is expensive, so we don't necessarily feed it throughout lactation. We want to feed it in the dry cow diet and then the early lactation diet. So because it's expensive, we don't want to keep that high level in for all lactation. But the second thing I'll say is vitamins and minerals should be fed, not injected. That's really it's cheaper and way more effective to formulate cow rations properly, and so we supplement vitamins and minerals in the diet, and that way we don't have to inject them, because almost always when we inject vitamins and minerals, they are rapidly cleared by the kidneys and the liver and excreted in the urine and the feces. So injectable supplementation goes away, and now it depends on what vitamin we're talking about and what mineral we're talking about, but generally it goes away pretty quickly. So really they need it every day in the feed and not to be injected. But definitely very good evidence for vitamin E supplementation in the feed.
Which measures we could take if there's a massive mastitis in a herd? What would be the measure that you recommend?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, that what would you recommend in a massive mastitis break, let's say, in a herd?
Yeah, so the question was, what would I recommend in a massive mastitis outbreak in a herd? The first thing I would recommend is to do some culturing to find out the bacteria that we're dealing with. Definitely if we get a big mastitis outbreak, I would do some culturing. The second thing I'll tell you is, in my experience, I told you that I don't have a lot of experience with mycoplasma, but in my experience, if you all of a sudden get a whole bunch of cows with mastitis, it very well may be mycoplasma. So that's why we have to do culturing, and we have to include looking for mycoplasma in our cultures. Third thing I would do is stand in the parlor and watch my milkers, and make sure everyone is doing their job correctly. And then also look from around the corner or where they can't see you, because we all know that the milkers do their job correctly when the boss is watching, but they might not do so good when the boss is not watching. So figure out a way to watch them and they don't know you're watching them. But so in a big outbreak, I would first do some culturing, make sure I look for mycoplasma, and then see what's going on in the parlor. And the culturing, by that time, the culture results are back, and we'll know if we have a contagious or environmental. And we'll know, if we have an environmental, then we need to look at the cows during the 23 hours that they're not in the parlor. And if we have a contagious, then we have to look in the parlor.
Thank you, Dr. Lowell. We have another question. What about the use of tetracyclines for mastitis treatment?
Yeah, so the question is use of tetracyclines for mastitis treatment. And I know that there are some intramammary tubes in other parts of the world that have tetracycline. At least I think so. I am not familiar at all with that, because I have never had that available in the United States. I do know that I sometimes use tetracycline systemically in those E. coli cows before we had ceftiofur. More recently, I probably would have used ceftiofur systemically in those E. coli cows, but again, we're treating the rest of the cow. We're not treating the mammary gland. But I really have no experience using tetracycline containing tubes in the mammary gland, so I really can't comment.
Thank you, doctor. According to California test, could we be close to the diagnosis or the presence of bacteria?
Yes, absolutely. So the question was the California mastitis test. What does that really mean? And the CMT or California mastitis test is a test for somatic cells. It's a somatic cell count. And the somatic cell count has to be about 500,000 to make it a little cloudy, and it has to be about over 1 million to make it a gel. So if she has a CMT reaction, basically we know she has a very high somatic cell count in that quarter. The CMT is basically, it's a very simple test. How it works is there's two components. There's basically a detergent that makes bacterial cells makes somatic cells, so white blood cells break apart. So the detergent breaks the cells to liberate the DNA from the nucleus of the cell. And then the second component of CMT is something that makes DNA stick together. So we really have DNA in milk is going to come mostly from somatic cells. So CMT is mostly a somatic cell count, and it works very well. It's so simple, it's cheap, and so I've even wondered, you notice on my selective dry cow therapy slide where I talked about, remember that a cow level somatic cell count is an average, and we can be fooled by that. I would wonder if maybe incorporating CMT in selective dry cow just to check and make sure she doesn't have, one hot quarter might be an idea. But CMT is very effective. I always used it in practice, and it's basically a somatic cell count. That's what it is, and the somatic cell count has to be very high to get a reaction.
Thank you, Dr. Lowell. Midla, you are listening our message for closing. We have many questions today. This is our first session for the virtual Maxi Leche 2020 on behalf of MSD. Thank you very much to all the people that connected this afternoon and that we are working our sessions. We are going to be every Thursday, 6 p.m. Central Time. It's the same time for Colombia right now and Peru. The next session, we are going to have Dr. Julio Giordano. He's going to talk about alternatives to improve reproduction efficiency in heifers. He is professor at Cornell University. Dr. Lowell, thank you so much for being with us in this first session. And Tiago and all the cattle team, in behalf of the team, I'm very happy to start these sessions. Welcome to Maxi Leche next Thursday, 6 p.m. Be here.